Order, order. Sorry, I've always wanted to do that. Thank you so much. Got a robe and everything. Good afternoon and welcome to the debate chamber. Thank you so much for coming down. It's going to be a really exciting really exciting session. The motion that we will be debating today is this House believes that the world in 2030 will be better for young people. But before we begin, before we introduce the panelists, let's take the temperature in the room. Let's see what you think. Each of you should have a clicker. It doesn't turn on a television. It lets you vote. And I would like you to vote for or against the motion. 1 will enable you to vote for the motion, 2 will enable you to vote against the motion, and 3 means that you're undecided. You'll have 10 seconds to vote from when I say go, and the motion again is this House believes that the world in 2030 will be better for young people. All right, ready, steady. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, it's 52% for, 26% against, 21% undecided. Okay, we're in the game. Let's meet our panelists. May I introduce the speakers who are speaking for the motion. It's Shea Gopaul, the Executive Director of the Global Apprenticeship Network, and Victoria Ibiwoye, the Director and Founder of One African Child Foundation for Creative Learning. And speaking against the motion is Professor Fernando Reimers, the Faculty Director of the International Education Policy at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Khadija, Bakhtiar, the Director of Participant and Alumni Impact for Teach for All. So the way it's going to work today is that I will invite our one speaker to speak for the motion, and a speaker to speak against the motion, and then another speaker to speak for the motion, and another speaker to speak against the motion. We will then have some time for questions, and then a brief summary from either side, at which time you'll have the opportunity to vote again, and we'll see how things have shifted. But without further ado, let's begin. May I invite to speak for the motion, first Shea Gopaul. Shea, you'll have 7 minutes to speak. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Just look at the people in this room. Look at the people this morning speaking. Yesterday in the Ed Talks, amazing things are happening. How can we not be optimistic? But of course, negative press attracts the media, sells stories, but you may find it hard to believe, but we're actually doing very well. Let's just look at the history over the last 25, 30 years, and let's look at some of the numbers. Since 1990, childhood deaths have been cut in half. Childhood vaccines is the highest it's ever been, 86%. And the last 25 years, extreme poverty has been cut in half. Illiteracy has radically decreased in 2016 to 14%, whereas in 1980, it was at 44%. Life expectancy, disposable incomes are increasing, and one is less likely to be killed in a conflict. These are very promising trends. We're on a good track, and the future can only be better. But there are really 3 reasons why I think the future is going to be great. Number 1, it is going to be led by young people and women. Young people today are talking about the sharing, caring economy. How can we lose? Second, I'm optimistic because AI and big data will assist us in getting more informed, taking better choices, decisions, and having access to so many wonderful tools. And lastly, yes, there are many challenges, there are many problems, but we need to do this together, bringing the public and the private sector together to build partnerships to address such things as healthcare, climate change, and education. Girls, women, the data. 52 million more girls are in school in 2015 compared to 2010. 69% of girls worldwide completed primary education compared to 45% in 2010. The USAID study indicated that when 10% more girls go to school, a country's GDP increases by an average of 3%. When women have the same amount of land as men, there is over a 10% increase in crop yields. Female leaders use different leadership styles, but they also lead to higher organizational performance, clear expectations, rewards, people development, participative decision-making. Particularly with the rise of AI, most employers have identified that the most important element is not IQ, it is EQ, empathy, emotional intelligence. The young people today, of those born between 1981 and 1986, 62% want to work for a company that has a positive impact. Half prefer working for a purposeful company rather than getting a higher salary. 53% work harder if they can make a difference for others. How can we not be positive and optimistic? New technologies require innovative workers, but more importantly, collaborative, listening workers. It's not the what, it is the who and the how we use the technology. Technology can be the angel, not the devil. McKinsey estimates that online talent platforms alone are increasing and connecting young people to the right work. By 2025, $2.7 trillion can be added to GDP. Yes, some jobs are being abolished, but according to Accenture, what's more important is that the jobs are changing. And the challenge here is 35% of the skills that were required yesterday will change in the future. And with algorithms, even recruitment processes are being no longer biased by gender and disadvantage. Online platforms, what do I need to say? Just yesterday we saw so many amazing programs out there for Africa, Latin America, Asia, all over the world. Lastly, I'm optimistic because I see the public and the private realizing we have a problem and we need to come together. At the Global Apprenticeship Network, we are a coalition of companies and public sector groups and international organizations such as the International Labor Organization and OECD. 75 million youth are unemployed, and yet 40% of the employers are saying they can't find the correct talent and skills. What is needed is more driven employer education, apprenticeships, work readiness programs. Employers need to be part of the solution. And by the way, they will end up paying for some of this. Who better to teach us about the technology than those who have invented it? Again, let's bring the public and private around the table. Companies know that there is a war for talent, and companies are adapting to the changing desires and needs of young people, which is a positive thing. Ethical consumption, eco-friendly products, social impact funds, and better life-work balance. Change in policies, change in behaviors requires the voice, the time, the resources of all concerned youth and government and the private sector. Yes, 2030 will be a better place for all of us, including our planet.
Thank you so much, Professor Reimers. May I invite you to give your response?
What is progress? Is progress the mere increase in life expectancy? the lifting of people all over the world from the most abject conditions of poverty so they can stay alive? Is progress the development of remarkable technologies? Or is progress about hoping for a world in which most people demonstrate the kind of agency demonstrated by the three remarkable high school students from Parkland High School who spoke to us this morning? Is progress about leaving the dystopian 1983 world that Professor Sharma warned against this morning? Or is progress about living in ways that allow all humans to have the freedoms to be architects of their own lives and contributing members of their communities? The answer to these questions is core to the subject of our debate this morning. As Vikas Pota mentioned in his opening remarks, youth in 2030 are in school today. So the question we need to address in this chamber is whether schools are today preparing students to live better. If we look at the past, even the last 7 decades, there is no question that humanity has experienced great progress. In 1947, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, only 2 in 5 persons of school age went to school. And the world at that time had 2.5 billion humans. Today, 7 billion humans live on this planet, and 9 out of 10 go to school. Now that is progress. That progress created a shared experience for all of humanity by building an institution designed explicitly to pass on to the young that which each generation considers good and worthwhile, and to pass on to the young the capacities to make the world better. If all those schools that were invented were like Parkland High School and educated students with the competencies demonstrated by the 3 students who spoke to us this morning, I would say unequivocally that youth in 2030 will be better than they are today. The students who spoke to us this morning demonstrated great capacity to discern right from wrong, sophisticated problem-solving abilities to understand the reasons that guns are so prevalent in the United States. They demonstrated skills to find a point of entry and begin to tackle the problem. They demonstrated the capacity for strategic thinking, for collaboration, for organization. They demonstrated personal responsibility and courage. They showed that they have the flexibility to deal with ambiguity and with uncertainty. Now, it is no accident that these students demonstrated those skills because Parkland High School is a very good school. But the majority of the world's children, 90% of which live in the developing world, do not go to schools like Parkland High School. In fact, most children in the world go to schools where they don't even learn to read and write or basic math. They don't have the opportunity to develop the advanced cognitive skills, interpersonal skills, and intrapersonal skills that the 3 student leaders demonstrated this morning. In fact, in the countries that participate in the periodic assessments conducted by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the PISA studies, a great majority of those students do not have the capacities to participate meaningfully in the societies in which they live. So how do we make sense of this paradox? That in spite of the remarkable progress of the last 7 decades in inventing institutions that have included all children, we have not been able to translate those institutions into providing effective opportunities for students to gain the capacities that would allow them to participate in their societies. Now, the answer to this paradox is in this chamber. And in other convenings like this, we have collectively failed at building on the remarkable achievements of the last 7 decades to turn those schools into the kind of institutions that actually educate students in a way as those students who spoke to us this morning are educated. Students who can improve the world. It is this failure that is at the heart of the growing discontents we see around the world. It is this failure that is the foundation of the degradation of politics, of the social fabric, of the social contract, of the environment. Now, it is worth remembering that the global education movement that began 7 decades ago received impetus from a group of leaders who responded to the horror of World War II, who understood the damage and the harm that had been caused by the rise of fascism and the use of violence to annihilate 6% of humanity. Now, it's also worth remembering that the place where democracy broke down, Germany, was considered 100 years ago one of the most educated countries in the world. Now, my hope is that it will not take that kind of violence for us to take responsibility to transform schools that actually empower students to improve the world. But until that happens, I will have to say that today, unequivocally, the conditions are in place so that the world in 2030 will be, for young and for old, a lot worse than it is today.
Thank you so much, Victoria Ibiwoye. Your response.
A glimpse at what the future would look like in 2030 is both interesting and scary, but I have no doubt that it will be better for young people. In the words of Vincent van Gogh in a letter to his brother Theo, he said, and I quote, "I cannot foretell the future, Theo, but one thing that I do know is that the eternal law is that all things change. Think back to 10 years ago and things were different. The circumstances, the mood of the people, in fact, everything. And 10 years from now, much is bound to change." This statement resonates strongly with me and the community where I come from. 10 years ago, bad roads riddled with potholes in the residential area that leads to the main city. Headlines of tabloids were incomplete without news of car accidents and loss of lives. Having a mobile phone is like a luxury and a magic that everybody wanted in their homes. Going to the best school is only created for the children of the wealthy, and girls who come from marginalized families had slimmer chances of getting educated or contributing meaningfully to societal development. Terrorist attack in the north displaced so many families and left so many people homeless. I cannot deny that these challenges that we faced some of these challenges are still in existence, but one thing that I can assure you, and I can proudly say, is that the narrative is changing. According to worldmedia.com, the population of the world by 2030 would be 8.5 billion people. That is nearly 1 billion people added to us. What does this mean to me as a young person? It means that the crowd in New Delhi and India will still be there, and the need to fight for our survival will still be intact. It means that as a young person, we will scamper for jobs left undone by robots and machine. But also it means that the way that we approach work today is constantly being redefined and is constantly evolving. And that is the power of education for sustainable development. The workforce of 2030, as my colleague has said, will be based on building relationship, fostering teamwork, enhancing critical thinking and complex problem solving, and most importantly, the ability to take initiatives rather than simply following instructions. And this is at the center of the target 4.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals 4 on quality education. I paraphrase, it says that by 2030, all learners would have acquired the knowledge, skills, values, attitude, and experiences that would enable them become active local citizens and responsible leaders leading sustainable lifestyles. More than ever before, we see young people taking initiative to transform the world and ensure that the future gets better for young people. And an example of that is one of the 10 finalists of the Global Teachers Prize, whose work is to connect refugee children to education through Skype. There are so many stories and so many examples of people, institutions, organizations, companies working to make the world better for young people. 10 years ago, that would be a job solely left to the government. But today, you find a lot of individuals taking initiatives, and you see young people at the forefront. Youth are no longer sitting down as beneficiaries. They are standing up to say that we want to shape our future. And this really inspires me. According to research, there is improvement in health-related research, and by 2030, malaria probably would have found a cure. Also, 3D plant organs and tissues would be used in operations and so many things that you have out there. Also, by 2030, the leaders of the free world will no longer be based on superpowers such as the United States, China, Russia, and Germany. It will be all countries coming to work together to ensure that the Agenda 2030 is achieved. Also, our world will become so interconnected because the refugees and migrants of today will become the CEOs of tomorrow. I believe that the world is going to be far better for young people, but that depends on what we do with our hands. It depends on what we do with our hearts. And most importantly, it depends on taking practical and realistic steps today to make sure that the world becomes better. A lot of people in this room are already working to ensure that the world becomes better. There are so many individuals who have organizations working to ensure that our world gets better for young people. And I have no doubt that the world will be better for youth by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khadija.
Hello, good afternoon. A very rosy picture of the world that has been painted by our worthy proposition for today. I'm going to try and take off the rose-tinted glasses for a second, because I think it's really, really important that if you're going to try and solve for the challenge that's in front of us, that we have to be real about what that challenge is, what the scale, the scope, the nature of that challenge is. And so an alternate picture, backed up not by isolated pockets of success and good, hopeful examples, but hardcore real data that the experts are giving us today. What does that world of 2030 look like? What we know about that world is that we will need to be producing enough food to feed an additional 2 million people. The majority of this demand, 85% of this extra demand for food, is going to come from poor, developing countries. What we also know about this world is that the world in 2030 will only have about 60% of the water that it needs. It is also likely, the World Bank is telling us, that climate change will have reversed many of the development gains that we've already made, pushing an additional 100 million people into extreme poverty. This is what we're hearing from the UN. This is what we're hearing from the World Food Programme. This is what we're hearing from every research, every credible research that's happening today. These are just numbers though, right? We all know and we have to recognize that there is growing inequality globally. We all know, we recognize, we see around us the rise, the march forward of right-wing groups and governments that are shutting down borders, forcing us all to live in more and more further contained spaces. We see a rise in homophobia. We see a rise in racism. We see a rise in xenophobia. We see differentiation. We see all of us going back into our shells. That's the world that we are going to continue to see in 2030. Not the very beautiful world that we were talking about earlier. And the reality of it is that the brunt of all of this falls on the youth. And the youth, where do the majority of the youth live, right? Let's just de-aggregate this for a second. And let's talk about the youth, where most of the youth are going to be living. That's going to be in places like Africa and Asia. They're going to be living in systems that are already burdened, that are already constrained. They are going to be living in systems that have so far not been able to provide their children and their young people with the safety and security and the quality of life that each one of us deserves. And by 2030, there are going to be a lot many more young people in those countries. So what do we do then, right? Our proposition has said one thing that of course, I completely agree with. This challenge, it requires us to come together, work together, to have better governance, right? But the point to be noted there is that there is no magic wand to make that happen. Right? Technology is not a panacea. If technology were the answer, we would have solved for many of the world's greatest challenges by now, because in many, many domains, we already have the requisite technology. But that hasn't happened yet. And that is because these challenges that we're facing are about governance. These challenges that we're facing are about people. They're human challenges. They're not technical challenges. And that is why they're so difficult to fix. But the very first step in trying to fix them, as yes, we would all love to come together to do, is to recognize just how bad things are, is to recognize with our eyes wide open that what we're on track to right now in 2030 is a worse that is much, much worse off for not just young people, but all of us, right? And that is what we're trying to just say here today. One thing that we've talked about a lot, right, is what is good? And I think that we're setting a very low bar when we start to define good and a better life in terms of people will be able to live more, right? We won't die so much in conflict. We define better in terms of child mortality rates going down. We define better in terms of people learning how to read and write, right? But is that really how you or I would define a better life for ourselves? When we turn to ourselves, we define better in terms of happiness, right? Fulfillment, joy. So if I were to reframe this question and ask, will young people in 2030 be happier? What evidence do we have against that? Very little. So this reminds me of a study that Harvard did. I'm sure many of you have already read it, where they tracked 200-something people over 80 years, and they found that the only real thing that defines a person's happiness, that determines how happy you will be, is the number of close relationships that you have in your life. And what do we have around us that says that we are enabling our children and our young people to develop more close relationships in their lives so that they can be happier, so that they can be more fulfilled, so that they can be engaged, involved in their communities, so that they can be connected to something other than a phone screen? And that is why we are seeing a world today where today's young people, 20% of them, that's a whopping 240 million young people, are suffering from mental health disorders. Right? This is an acute problem. So we have to change the question, right? We have to say, will the world in 2030 be a happier, more joyful place for young people? And then the final thing, right? Professor Reimers has already talked about this a little bit, so I won't belabor the point. But it feels incredibly important to me to think about what is happening to our children today, who in 2030 are going to be in our youth, right? And the way that it helps me to think about this is to think, the young woman who's going to be 23 years old in 2030 is today 9 years old, right? And since Pakistan, where I come from, has a huge child and youth population, chances are this young 9-year-old is in a Pakistani classroom. If this young 9-year-old is in a Pakistani classroom, the odds are 50-50 that she doesn't even know how to do basic division, much less all of these beautiful soft skills that we will need to be able to change the world in 2030, right? This child is not learning how to think critically or collaborate or to work with her peers. This child is not learning how to love herself in her community. This child is barely scraping by. And we're not changing that. Look at any of the global goals that we're setting for ourselves. All we're talking about is, are our kids in school? Are our kids passing school? Can our kids sign their name? That is the definition of literacy in Pakistan. Those are the questions we're not asking. We're not asking, are we preparing our kids to deal with the challenge of the world that we're going to leave them? And so what I would offer today is, we're not. We're not preparing our kids to be able to not just have technology, fight over technology, but use technology to create a better world. We're not preparing our kids to reach across borders, to reach beyond themselves and express love and tolerance for somebody that they don't know. We're not preparing our kids, and the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can start actually building the world that we want to see in 2030 for our kids, for us, for our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Powerful arguments on both sides, and I'm delighted that by the calculations of some of the panelists, I am still a young person, so thank you very much for that. I would like to open it up to questions now. May I encourage you to make your questions short and to the point, otherwise I'm going to bang my gavel. And please direct them to the for or against side of the room. Please.
My question is for this side of the argument, the more, let's say, dystopian view, which is the view that I personally agree with. I mean, the reality is that things aren't good. And maybe on this side of the argument, yeah, some of it looks good, some of the numbers look good, but the future is not looking so good. We have climate change refugees. They're expected to go up exponentially. So my question to you is, you touched upon education, the role of education to prepare our children to do better. Can we be a bit more specific? Because education needs a lot of reform. And I think some of the problems are rooted in systems that are very strong, the assessment system, measurement systems, different programs, IB programs, the British system. So do you have any suggestions on how we can really begin to reform the education system?
Yeah.
The answer is very simple. If we want students to develop the full range of capacities that the students from Parkland High School demonstrated them, if we want them to develop as whole human beings, we should make that the target. We should say that the goal of the curriculum is to develop cognitive skills, advanced cognitive skills, intrapersonal skills, interpersonal skills. And then we should support their teachers so they develop the capacity to teach those skills, and we should build school environments where that is the norm and not the exception. So it sounds like, if it's easy to do, why isn't it happening? It's not happening for the answers that Khadija mentioned. Because to achieve that in every school for every child is not something that depends on the decision of a single actor or institution. Even the most powerful government in the world cannot flick a switch and make that happen. To produce that kind of quality of instruction, which exists in schools like Parkland High School, requires the concerted efforts of a number of organizations in the public sector and in the private sector. This is a collective leadership challenge. And collective leadership is really hard to do. There are tons of people who talk about it, but there are not very many good examples of collective leadership in education. So that's the answer, to figure out how we're going to exercise effective collective leadership so that we can build coherent systems that educate students in school and that build lifelong learning systems so that individuals can continue developing their capacities in the much longer lives that hopefully we're all going to live.
Thank you. Please.
My question is to this side. I would wish to be in your place and to be believing that 2030 would be a better place for our young people. I'm Syrian, and obviously you know what being Syrian is about today. And I don't believe that actually the Syrian humanitarian crisis that has been described, the worst since World War II, is a crisis only pertaining to Syria. It's a system crisis. It's a world crisis about our system. So if our system are failing to enforce accountability and rather helping to perpetuate impunity, how on earth are we really believing that our young people will be able, young and women, will be able to lead when our system are failing?
I believe in the power of education for sustainable development. Our current education system, just preparing young people for professional lifestyles, is not enough. We need to inculcate the values of empathy, values of love, of kindness, of diversity in our youth. We cannot change what has happened. We cannot change the wars that have taken place. We cannot change the mindset of our leaders, but we can invest in the generation that we have today to help them see differently. We can train the youth of today to be more empathetic, to make better decisions. So I believe that education for sustainable development should be placed at the center of learning, and focus should be on young people. Also, education should be continuous. It should not just stop within the walls of the school. It should go outside of the school walls, even to our daily lifestyles. So I believe that young people, we are at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. Youth are the future. And how we prepare young people for the future is also very important. We need to prepare young people for a world that is more just, more tolerant, more peaceful, and most importantly, more sustainable. And the best way to achieve that is through education for sustainable development.
I think I'd like to add to this is that what is happening in your country is inexcusable. Our leaders are failing us. There's no excuse. But I think with young people today, we're going to try to avoid what is happening in your country. And if there's just one sort of bright story, yesterday, there's a mobile app that is being developed for young people in refugee camps to learn to adapt when they come into new countries, to understand the new cultures, the new languages, and to pick up technical skills. That's a small drop in the water. But I'm sorry for what's happening, and there are some things we can control, but I'm hoping the future we will avoid such things.
Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you, Boaz Waruku from Kenya. I come from a farming community. And indeed, sorry that I came in late, but I'm persuaded by the side that I joined to think more critically so that when we vision what would be the 2030 look like, I think I'm reminded of where I come from. In the farming community, if you want to have a good harvest, you must plant good seeds. Right now, I would be asking for us to have the 2030 that would mirror what my dear sister or daughter there said. What exactly are the seeds that we are planting now that would enable us to have that good future where the youth would have fulfillment? Two, where I come from also within that farming community, a lot of learning or lessons learned are through mentorship, coaching, and tutoring. What are the good habits of us, the old generation here, that you see worth picking up? We have failed to make 2030 come today. What is it that you're learning from us that you'd like to use to make the 2030 a reality? Thank you so much.
Would you like to respond?
Thank you very much for that comment. I would like to share with you a quote from Brene Brown, and she said that first and foremost, we need to be the adult we want our children to be, and we should model the kindness we want to see. So a lot of the future is dependent on what we do today. And as young people, we are observers. Children observe a lot from what they see, even from our inactions. So we need to be the kind of leaders we want our world to be. If we want to see a world that is more peaceful and more sustainable, we need to start from now. And we need to start, sharing those lifelong values like kindness, empathy, teaching our children to be more empathetic in the things that we do. These values go a very long way. That is one. And did you ask what are those things that we would like to learn from you? I think it is very important to there is this generational gap. And I think it is very important to have our leaders or our parents, our teachers support us young people with full force. A lot of young people are doing amazing work, but along the way, they may be discouraged when their efforts are not being recognized or appreciated. So it is very important to have the efforts of young people, no matter how small, celebrated and appreciated. And it is very important to share best practices of what young people are doing to other young people, to their peers. And this way, youth would be more encouraged. So we look up to you to listen to us. We want to have a dialogue. We look up to you to encourage us. We look up to you to use the stories of young people who are making a difference as an example, even at the community level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite our panelists to begin their closing arguments now. May I invite Shea to give her closing arguments for the Foresight. 3 minutes.
So my colleagues, maybe you should be wearing my glasses. I do think they're not all foggy. But your point, my esteemed colleague, about education figures. A Harvard study, if I may quote, from Pakistan says that they have done some research where they found in villages assigned to public-private partnership schemes, enrollment increased by 30% and the test scores improved. Parents are saying that they prefer that their daughters become teachers rather than housewives. Ghana, a regional leader in delivering education for all, 84% net enrollment rate, and they are reaching gender parity. Rwanda is one of the top performing countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I have many more stories. But you are right. Education needs disruption. And it's not going to be in the classrooms in Boston or in Florida. It's going to be online. We don't need to be sitting in front of a classroom with the teacher. We have technology, but what we do need is the grandmother, the teacher behind that child, patting them on the back, saying, good job. Continue. Access is there, and you will argue that not everybody in the world has access to the internet. True. But in Africa today, the mobile phone everyone has, you can get SMS, and you can receive programs and educational programs. There's an educational program by SMS for refugees today. And yes, migration is an issue, but guess what? Healthcare, according to the ILO, is going to be the biggest job creator. With aging populations, guess what? We need people to take care of us. In many countries, you have slow growth in population. The people from the south will need to migrate to the north, and guess what? With or without politicians, this is going to happen because we need these people. There are jobs out there. I was at the other night, the anniversary of Mauritius, 50 years of independence. And I was amazed. I was looking at this country sort of saying, and I was there 40 years ago, saying, what has happened? What has changed? 100% literacy, healthcare free, education free. 2% in every company of their CSR budget needs to go into education. Policies matter. Governments can take decisions. So there's healthcare free, there's education free, but in their constitution, there is no money for the military. Policies matter. Lastly, I would say, with innovation, we are going to become more efficient, and I think we are going to have a better quality of life. We're going to have more time for creativity, the arts, entertainment, the sharing, caring economy. And to my esteemed colleague who said it's about happiness, what could make you more happy than having more time with your children, your elderly parents, and your community, trying to make it a better world for all?
So this has been a wonderful debate. But just to remind us, right, the topic before us today, will the world in 2030 be a better place for young people? Implicit in that is, given what we're seeing today, given historical trends, given the path that we are on right now, will the world be a better place for our young people in 2030? And that is why, that is what makes me think, right? That is what makes me think. There's the one piece of this that our proposition is forgetting. Of course we have to be hopeful about the future. There's no disagreement there. Of course we have to make every effort that we can to not get there. Right? Of course we have to come together to work on this. Of course governments should get up and change things. Of course at the global level, all of our institutions should come together. Of course each of us has a role to play. Of course there's potential in this situation, right? But the only way to activate that is if we get very real about what path we're on right now. There's no other way, right? There's a thing that we do at Teach for Pakistan, the organization that I work for. We hammer home to our teachers this idea of a sense of urgency, right? Because our teachers are working with the most underprivileged kids, the kids who are furthest behind in our communities. And we say to them, unless you're working with a serious sense of urgency and realism about what's going to happen to these kids, unless we do well with them today, you're not going to get there. And that is what we're hoping we can leave you with today. A sense of urgency that what we're heading towards is a very, very, very bad path. And so a couple of things that our esteemed colleagues have mentioned, right, is I want to talk a little bit about this study from Pakistan that's being touted right now as one of the greatest breakthroughs in education, biggest public sector reforms in education in the last many decades. The reality of this is that all change that has happened through those reforms, and many good things have happened, right? None of those are changes that we spoke about just 15 minutes ago, right? They're not about infusing kids with leadership. They're not about growing children's potential to change the world. They're not about critical thinking ability. They're not about helping kids figure out and do well in those jobs in 2030 that haven't even been created yet. They're just about kids being able to pass 5th grade. They're about more kids going to school. And this is the problem. Because we do not understand and really step into the urgency of the situation. That is why we keep setting the bar very, very low, right? That's what we have to change. That is our challenge to you today. And so to bring this back, right, I think we've got this. I think we can make a difference here. But what really needs to happen, I think, is for all of us to figure out, where do I stand in this system, right? Who am I in this system? In the system that requires collective leadership to solve for, as Professor Reimers was talking about. Where am I in the system? What can I do today to move us forward, closer towards that better world? And as you do that, please remember to tell yourself, if I don't take that action today, we're all going to be living in a world that is much, much worse off in 2030. If such a world is still around, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. We've heard some fascinating arguments, and it's time to see where everybody stands. At the beginning of the session, I think 20% of you were undecided. Let's see if anyone's changed their minds. I'm going to call another vote, and again, as in the first time, you're going to use your clickers to vote for or against the motion. The motion is, this House believes that young people, that the world in 2030 will be better for young people. You may click 1 to support the motion, you may click 2 to vote against the motion, or you may click 3 if the last hour of debates hasn't done anything to change your mind. You'll have 10 seconds to vote, starting now. Okay. 40% for, 49% against, and 11% still undecided. So that's a big swing in favor of the against. And on that very depressing note, let me thank our panelists, and please give them a huge round of applause. Thank you, everyone.